Beneath the snow-crowned peaks of the Rocky Mountains, a Silicon Valley millionaire parks his SUV outside a crumbling house, haunted by a ghost from his past. Inside, a single mother with calloused hands and a shattered spirit clutches her children, ready to fight the world, or collapse beneath its weight. This isn't a fairy tale. This is Cedar Hollow. Secrets buried for 15 years are about to erupt, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because some stories demand to be witnessed. The Rocky Mountains loomed like ancient sentinels over the sleepy town of Cedar Hollow, their peaks dusted with the first snow of November. Declan Frost tightened his cashmere scarf against the bite of the wind as he stepped out of his sleek black SUV. The scent of pine and wood smoke curled through the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, glass-walled tech campuses of Silicon Valley he'd left behind that morning. He hadn't planned to stop here. This detour was meant to be a 20-minute coffee break during his cross-country drive to a summit in Denver. But the sight of the dilapidated wooden house clinging to the mountainside, its roof sagging under neglect, had rooted him to the spot. This is ridiculous, he thought, squinting at the peeling paint. It's been 15 years. She probably doesn't even live here anymore. Yet here he was, trudging up the cracked stone path, his polished Oxford sinking into mud. The porch creaked under his weight as he raised his hand to knock. Before his knuckles met the door, it swung open. Lila Hart stood silhouetted against the dim interior, her auburn hair streaked with gray, her eyes wide with a mix of defiance and something softer, fear. She clutched a toddler to her hip, the child's thumb lodged firmly in his mouth. Behind her, a girl of about 6 peeked around her legs, her thumb tracing the frayed hem of Lila's threadbare sweater. "Declan," Lila said flatly, her voice stripped of the venom that had once made his high school years a torment. "What do you want?" He opened his mouth to speak, but the words lodged in his throat. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been laughing as she'd shoved his face into a locker, her cheerleading squad chanting, "Frosty the Freak." Now her cheeks were hollow, her hands callous from hard labor. The transformation was jarring. "I heard about Damon," he said finally, hating how inadequate the words sounded. "I wanted to see if you needed money." She cut him off, her tone razor-sharp. "A job? A pity check?" The toddler squirmed, and she shifted him to her other hip, her knuckles whitening. "Save it, Declan. I didn't crawl out of that hell just to become your charity case." "It's not like that," he protested, but she held up a hand, her eyes flashing. "You think I don't remember?" she hissed, her voice low to avoid alarming the children. "You think I don't know what they called you? What I called you? And now you're here playing the hero. Well, I won't be your redemption arc." Declan flinched. The honesty was brutal but deserved. He'd spent years burying the memory of that locker room. The taunts, the way he'd frozen when Lila had cornered him after gym class. Yet here she was, stripped of her queen bee armor, every line on her face a testament to a life that had chewed her up and spat her out. "Lila," he said quietly, "I'm not here to relive high school. I just want to help." She stared at him, her gaze piercing. For a heartbeat, he saw the girl she'd once been. The one who'd sneered at his thrift store clothes, who'd mocked his stutter. Then her shoulders sagged and she stepped back, the fight draining out of her. "Come in," she muttered. "But wipe your feet. The floor's just been mopped." The inside of the house was sparse but spotless, the furniture draped in mismatched quilts. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, its aroma warm and inviting. Lila set the toddler down, and he immediately toddled toward a basket of wooden blocks. The girl lingered, eyeing Declan with cautious curiosity. "Sophie, go play with your brother," Lila said gently, and the girl obeyed, though not before shooting Declan one last wary glance. They sat at a wobbly kitchen table, the silence thick between them. Declan traced a crack in the wood, searching for words. "I'm serious about helping," he said at last. "My company's expanding. I could use someone with your organizational skills." Lila snorted. "You mean my talent for bossing people around?" "I mean your grit," he countered. "You've survived things I can't even imagine." "That's not nothing." She studied him, her green eyes unreadable. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. "Why now?" she asked softly. "After all these years?" He hesitated. The truth was a knot in his chest, a memory of another bullied kid, one he'd failed to protect. But this wasn't the time. Because everyone deserves a second chance, he said instead. Including me. Lila looked away, her jaw tight. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I can't be weak again, Declan. Not for you. Not for anyone. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Declan stood, nodding stiffly. I'll leave my card, he said, placing it on the table. Just think about it. As he drove away, the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the mountains in white. In the rearview mirror, he saw Lila standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him leave. The Pine Cone Cafe was a relic of Cedar Hollow's past. A log cabin with checkered curtains, where the coffee tasted like nostalgia and the pie crusts were always slightly burnt. Declan chose a corner booth, his laptop open but untouched, the glow of the screen reflecting his unease. He'd sent Lila a text that morning. Meet me here. Please. No explanation. Just the address. She arrived 10 minutes late, her boots clicking against the floorboards. Gone was the frayed sweater. Today she wore a crisp navy coat, her hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. The wariness in her eyes hadn't faded. You're persistent, I'll give you that, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Declan pushed a menu toward her. Best pancakes in 3 states. Fact. Lila didn't smile. I'm not here for small talk. Neither am I. He closed his laptop. I want to show you something. Before she could protest, he turned the device toward her. A news article filled the screen. Frost Industries acquires struggling Cedar Hollow logging company. Your husband's old employer, Declan said quietly. They were 2 weeks away from bankruptcy. Now they're mine. Lila's face paled. Why are you telling me this? Because Damon's been asking around about you. Declan paused, his voice steady but his fists clenched under the table. He's not just going to disappear, Lila. And I can't stand by while he... Like you stood by when Jason Myers pushed me down the bleachers? She shot back. The words hung in the air, sharp and sudden. Declan froze. Jason Myers. The name was a ghost he'd buried. Yeah, Lila continued softer now. I remember. You were there. You just didn't do anything. The cafe seemed to shrink. Declan stared at his hands, the scar on his knuckle from that day still faintly visible. I couldn't, he admitted. Not then. But I can now. Lila studied him, her anger giving way to something heavier. You don't get it, do you? Damon isn't just some villain in a bad movie. He's broken. His dad was a drunk, his mom overdosed when he was 12. He used to cry in the locker room after football practice, saying he didn't want to end up like them. And I? She trailed off, her thumb tracing the rim of her coffee cup. You what? Declan prompted. I thought I could fix him, she whispered. Stupid, right? I thought if I loved him enough he'd stop hitting me, stop using me as his ATM. But the more I gave, the more he took. Until all I had left were the kids. And even then he threatened to take them. Declan reached across the table, hesitating before covering her hand with his. She didn't pull away. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. Or him. I'm just trying to understand. Lila laughed bitterly. Understanding doesn't pay the bills, Declan. No, he agreed. But it's a start. They sat in silence as the waitress refilled their coffee. Outside, the first hints of autumn colored the mountainsides gold. Why Horizon Tech? Lila asked abruptly. Why not just write a check and call it charity? Declan leaned back, surprised by the shift. Because I need someone who can handle chaos. Someone who's stared down worse than a boardroom full of Silicon Valley sharks. You've got a mind for strategy, Lila. Even back in high school, you knew how to dismantle people. She raised an eyebrow. Flattery? Really? Fact, he corrected. You reduced me to a stuttering mess every time you walked into homeroom. Imagine what you could do with a PowerPoint. For the first time, Lila smiled, a small reluctant curve of her lips. You're crazier than I thought. Probably. Declan slid a folder across the table. Inside were schematics for a new app. Safe Haven, a platform connecting domestic abuse survivors to resources. This is what I want you to oversee. If you say no, I'll respect it. But if you say yes, you report directly to me. No pity. No special treatment. Lila flipped through the documents, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was steady. I'll need a salary. And daycare benefits. Declan grinned. Done. And one more thing, she added, meeting his gaze. If this blows up in my face, you don't get to play the hero. Deal. Deal. As Lila left the cafe, the weight of the folder in her hand felt foreign but hopeful. Declan watched her go, wondering if he'd just handed her a lifeline, or a grenade. The Horizon Tech office in downtown Cedar Hollow was a world away from the logging camps and dusty highways Lila had known. Glass walls reflected the jagged peaks of the Rockies, and the hum of productivity, keyboards clicking, hushed meetings, the occasional burst of laughter, felt alien yet exhilarating. Declan had given her a corner office with a view, but Lila refused it. Instead, she claimed a cubicle near the break room, its walls adorned with sticky notes and a single photo of Sophie and Ben taped crookedly to the monitor. She'd spent the first week studying spreadsheets, learning code, and biting back frustration when colleagues tiptoed around her like she might shatter. They think I'm your pet project, she said one evening, cornering Declan in the empty parking lot. The sunset painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, mirroring her mood. Declan leaned against his SUV, arms crossed. You're not wrong. Then why'd you hire me? Because you're the only one here who isn't afraid to call me on my bullshit. Lila blinked, caught off guard. That's your reason? It's the best one I've got. He pushed off the car, closing the distance between them. Look, I know you hate this, being here, feeling like you're back in high school with me pulling the strings. But I need you to trust me. Not because I'm some knight in shining armor, but because we're both trying to outrun the same ghosts. She opened her mouth to argue, but he held up a hand. Remember Jason Myers? The question hung in the air. Lila's throat tightened. Of course she remembered. Jason, the linebacker with a chip on his shoulder, who'd shoved Declan into a locker so hard the dent was still there. Who'd cornered her in the gymnasium after the championship game, his hands rough on her wrists, his breath reeking of cheap beer. I froze, Declan said quietly. I could have stopped him. I should have stopped him. But I just stood there. Lila stared at him, the pieces clicking into place. That's why you're doing this? Guilt. No, he said fiercely. Guilt is what kept me up nights after you left. This, he gestured to the building behind them, is about making sure neither of us has to stand by and watch someone get hurt again. For a long moment Lila said nothing. Then slowly she nodded. Fine. But if you ever pull that I know what's best for you crap again, I'll quit. Understood. A ghost of a smile touched Declan's lips. Crystal. The real test came 2 weeks later. Lila stood in front of the boardroom, her palms slick with sweat. The executives of Horizon Tech stared up at her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Declan sat at the head of the table, unreadable. The Safe Haven app isn't just a tool, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. It's a lifeline. And right now it's broken. She clicked the projector remote, pulling up a map of Cedar Hollow. Red dots clustered in the poorer districts, reports of domestic disturbances, overdoses, missing persons. These are the people we're supposed to help. But your algorithms are only flagging 30% of cases. Why? Because you're looking for victims, not survivors. A man in a pinstripe suit raised an eyebrow. And you're the expert on survival, Miss Hart? The room tensed. Lila met his gaze head-on. I'm the expert on staying alive when everyone expects you to fail. That's why I'm here. Now, are you going to listen? Or keep pretending this is just another PR stunt? The silence afterward was deafening. Then Declan stood, clapping slowly. Brilliant, he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Let's rebuild it. From scratch. That night Lila found Declan in the parking lot again. This time with a bottle of whiskey and 2 paper cups. To broken crowns, he said, pouring. She clinked her cup against his. And the fools who wear them. They drank in silence, the weight of unspoken truth settling between them. For the first time in years Lila felt something she couldn't name. A flicker of hope, sharp and terrifying. The first snowfall of December blanketed Cedar Hollow in silence. Lila stood at the window of her makeshift office, a converted storage room at Horizon Tech, watching Declan argue with the deliverman outside. His voice carried through the glass, sharp and unyielding. Same old Declan, she thought. Except now, when he turned to glare at the man, there was a flicker of restraint in his eyes. The old Declan would have let his temper flare. This one clenched his jaw and handed over a check. "Mom!" Sophie's small voice broke her reverie. The girl stood in the doorway, her backpack askew. "Ben's crying again." Lila's stomach dropped. She followed Sophie to the daycare center down the hall, where Ben sat in a corner, his face buried in his knees. The teacher hovered nearby, helpless. "He won't tell me what's wrong," she whispered. Lila knelt beside her son, brushing his hair back. "Hey, buddy. What's the matter?" Ben lifted his head, tears streaking his cheeks. "A man at the park. He said he's my daddy." The room tilted. Lila's breath caught. "Damon." Declan found her in the parking lot an hour later, her hands gripping the steering wheel of her battered pickup. Snowflakes melted on the windshield, distorting the world beyond. "He's been here for weeks," she said, her voice hollow. "Watching the daycare. Following me to the grocery store. I thought it was paranoia." Declan's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I can handle it," she snapped, then deflated. "Because I wanted to prove I could." He leaned against the truck, arms crossed. "You don't have to prove anything. Not anymore." "I do," she insisted. "If I let you fight every battle for me, what's the difference between now and when I was with Damon?" The question hung between them, sharp and unanswerable. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday. Damon was suing for full custody, citing Lila's unstable employment history and questionable living conditions. Declan's lawyers moved swiftly, countering with evidence of Damon's DUIs, missed child support payments, and a sealed domestic violence charge from Lila's neighbor. But Damon wasn't fighting fair. He showed up at Horizon Tech at noon, reeking of whiskey and entitlement. Employees scattered as he shoved past security, cornering Lila by the elevators. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled, his face inches from hers. "You're nothing but a glorified secretary playing house with your sugar daddy." Lila stood her ground, her voice steady. "You're right. I'm not better than you. I'm just done being scared." Declan appeared then, his presence a cold wall between them. "You're trespassing, Damon." Damon sneered. "Still playing the hero, Frost? How's that working out for you?" "It's working," Declan said quietly, "because she's not a victim. She's a force." The words hung in the air, charged and unyielding. Damon's bravado wavered. He backed away, but not before tossing an envelope at Lila's feet. "Read it," he muttered. "Maybe you'll finally understand." The letter inside was brittle with age. "Dear Lila, if you're reading this, I'm probably dead. I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you deserved. But don't you dare waste your life hating me. You're stronger than this. Stronger than me. D." Lila stared at the page, Damon's messy scrawl blurring through her tears. Declan found her in the stairwell, the letter clutched in her fist. "He's not evil," she whispered. "He's just broken." Declan sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "So are you." "Thanks," she said with a watery laugh. "I'm serious. You're both broken. But you're also the only one trying to pick up the pieces." The custody hearing was a quiet affair. Damon didn't show. Instead, his lawyer submitted a signed affidavit. "I withdraw all claims. The children deserve a mother who isn't afraid to live." Lila never saw him again. The old logging road wound deep into Cedar National Forest, where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sky. Lila parked her truck at the trailhead, the engine dying with a shudder. She hadn't told Declan where she was going. Some battles she knew had to be fought alone. Damon waited at the clearing, his back to her, shoulders hunched against the cold. The man who'd once towered over her now seemed diminished, his leather jacket frayed, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You actually came," he said without turning. Lila stepped forward, the snow crunching under her boots. "You left the letter. I figured you owed me more than a goodbye." He turned then, his eyes bloodshot, a faint bruise on his jaw, a remnant of Declan's restraint weeks earlier. "You read it. Every word." She paused, her voice steady. "You're not the first person to apologize, Damon. But you're the first to mean it." He flinched. "How do you know?" "Because you didn't ask for forgiveness. You just stopped lying. A bitter laugh escaped him. Yeah, well, truth's a funny thing. It doesn't fix much, but it sure as hell clears the air. They stood in silence, the weight of unsaid things pressing down. Finally Lila spoke. Why the custody suit? After all these years? Damon kicked at a stone, sending it skittering into the underbrush. I saw you at that cafe with Frost. You looked happy, like you'd finally gotten the life I'd stolen from you. And I hated it. Hated you for moving on. Hated myself for wanting to. Lila crossed her arms, the cold seeping through her coat. You think I'm happy? I'm surviving, Damon. There's a difference. Yeah. He met her gaze, raw and unguarded. Then why'd you bring me here? To rub it in? To make me feel like the monster everyone says I am? No, she stepped closer, her breath visible in the frosty air. I brought you here to tell you the truth. Not the one in your letter, the one you've been too scared to face. Damon stiffened. You're not your father, she said quietly. You're not a drunk. You're not a thief. You're just a man who's spent his whole life running from the wrong things. And if you keep running, you'll end up exactly where you started. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Damon's eyes glistened. What if I don't know how to stop? Then let someone else lead for once. Lila reached into her pocket, pulling out a faded photo. Sophie and Ben building a snowman last winter, their laughter frozen in time. They're not your punishment, Damon. They're your chance to be someone better. He took the photo, his hands trembling. I don't deserve this. No, Lila agreed. But you're not getting it for free. You earn it. One day at a time. Declan found her an hour later, sitting on the tailgate of her truck, staring at the mountains. You shouldn't have come alone, he said, leaning against the driver's door. I wasn't alone, she replied. I had the truth. And a really good lawyer. He smirked, then sobered. Where's Damon? Gone. She nodded toward the horizon, where a pickup truck kicked up dust on the highway. He's moving to his uncle's ranch in Montana. Says he wants to learn how to breathe again. Declan studied her profile. And you? What do you want? Lila hesitated, then smiled. A real one, small but bright. I want to stop running too. That night, as the town slept under a blanket of snow, Lila stood at the window of her new apartment, watching Sophie and Ben decorate a tiny Christmas tree. Declan had offered to buy them a bigger one, but she'd refused. Some things she knew couldn't be fixed with money. As Lila Hart stares at the horizon, a faded photo in her hand and a storm in her eyes, one question lingers. Can broken souls rebuild a future? Or will the ghosts of Cedar Hollow drag them back into the dark? The answer? It's buried in the next chapter. Stay tuned, or risk never knowing how far a second chance can truly go.